Ryan had always known he was adopted. His parents had told him as much from a young age. But what they never told him was that he had been rescued from a cult. A cult that believed in sacrificing infants to their dark god. And now that Ryan was a teenager, the cult had come to take him back. It started with strange noises in the middle of the night. Ryan would hear footsteps outside his bedroom window, whispers in the darkness, and strange symbols carved into the trees around his house. His parents brushed it off as kids playing pranks, but Ryan knew better. He felt like he was being watched. Then one night, it happened. Ryan woke up to find himself surrounded by hooded figures in the middle of the woods. They chanted in a language he didn't understand, and he could feel their eyes boring into him. He tried to run, but they caught him and dragged him back to their compound. The cult had grown since Ryan had been rescued as a baby. It was larger, more organized, and more dangerous. They had been planning for years to reclaim Ryan as their own, and now they finally had him. At first, they tried to brainwash him. They showed him the ways of their dark god, and tried to convince him to join their ranks. But Ryan refused. He knew that he didn't belong with them, that he was meant for something else. Something better. That's when they started the torture. They would lock him up in a dark, damp cell, and leave him there for days on end. They would starve him, beat him, and subject him to all sorts of unspeakable horrors. But still, Ryan refused to give in. He clung to his sense of self, and to the knowledge that he was meant for something greater. One day, the cult's leader came to see him. He was a tall, thin man with a face like a skull. He told Ryan that he was the chosen one, that he was meant to lead the cult into a new age of darkness. But Ryan knew better. He knew that the cult was wrong, that their god was nothing but a figment of their twisted imaginations. That's when he made his escape. He waited until the guards were distracted, then he slipped out of his cell and made a run for it. He ran through the dark, winding halls of the compound, dodging guards and ducking into shadows. He knew that he had to get out before they caught him. Finally, he burst through the doors of the compound and into the bright sunlight. He was free. He could feel the warm rays of the sun on his face, and the fresh air filling his lungs. He knew that he had escaped the cult, and that he was finally safe. But the cult wasn't done with him yet. They had been watching him, tracking his movements, and they knew where he was. They sent their soldiers after him, armed with knives and guns and other deadly weapons. Ryan ran as fast as he could, but he knew that he was no match for them. In the end, he had to fight. He turned and faced his attackers, ready to defend himself with everything he had. He fought like a cornered animal, with all the strength and ferocity that he could muster. He knew that he had to win, or he would die trying. In the end, Ryan emerged victorious. He defeated the cult soldiers, one by one, until they lay broken and defeated at his feet. He was battered, bruised, and bleeding, but he was alive. And he knew that he had won. But he also knew that the cult would never give up. They would always be after him, always hunting him down, always trying to get him back. As Ryan stood among the defeated soldiers of the cult, catching his breath and trying to make sense of what had just happened, he knew that his life would never be the same again. He had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, but he also knew that the cult would never give up its pursuit of him. Ryan knew he needed to leave his old life behind and start anew. He couldn't stay in the same place for too long, or the cult would surely find him. He packed his few belongings and began a new life on the run. He traveled from town to town, never staying in one place for too long. He changed his name, his appearance, and even his personality. He became a chameleon, blending into the background, never drawing attention to himself. He knew that the cult was always looking for him, and he needed to stay one step ahead of them. But no matter how far he ran, the memories of the cult and the horrors they had inflicted upon him followed him like a dark cloud. He had nightmares, flashbacks, and moments of intense fear that would grip him at unexpected times. Despite all of this, Ryan refused to let the cult win. He was determined to live his life on his own terms and not let the cult control him. He sought therapy and counseling to help him process the trauma he had experienced, and slowly but surely, he began to heal. Years went by, and Ryan began to feel like he had finally put his past behind him. He settled down in a small town, started a family, and built a life that he was proud of. He never forgot what had happened to him, but he learned to live with it. But just when he thought he was safe, the cult found him. They had been searching for him for years, tracking his movements, and waiting for the right moment to strike. And now they had found him. Ryan was ready this time. He had faced the cult before and knew what he was up against. He had prepared for this moment, and he was determined to protect his family at all costs. The cult attacked in the dead of night, just like they had years ago. But this time, Ryan was ready for them. He fought back with all his might, using every skill he had learned in his years on the run. He battled the cult members with a ferocity that they had never seen before, and they were forced to retreat. The battle was over, but Ryan knew that the war was far from won. He knew that the cult would never give up, and that they would keep coming after him and his family until they were either captured or dead. But Ryan was determined to keep fighting. He had survived against all odds, and he knew that he could do it again. He would never let the cult control him, and he would always protect his family, no matter what it took. As he stood there, watching the cult retreat into the darkness, Ryan knew that his battle was far from over. But he also knew that he was ready for whatever the cult threw at him. He had faced his demons and come out on top, and he was ready for whatever came next.
There was an old asylum on the outskirts of town that had been closed for years. It had a reputation for being haunted, and locals would tell stories of strange noises coming from inside, and shadowy figures seen lurking in the windows. One night, a group of friends decided to explore the abandoned asylum. They were all thrill seekers, looking for a new adventure. They parked their car on the side of the road and made their way through the overgrown vegetation, reaching the front entrance of the asylum. The front doors creaked loudly as they pushed them open. Inside, the asylum was dark and foreboding. The group used their flashlights to guide them through the maze of hallways, peering into rooms that were once occupied by patients. As they explored, strange things began to happen. They would hear footsteps behind them, but when they turned around, no one was there. They would see shadows move along the walls, but when they looked closer, there was nothing there. They tried to brush it off as their imaginations playing tricks on them, but the fear began to grow within them. As they ventured deeper into the asylum, they came across a room that was completely pitch black. They could hear faint whispers coming from inside, but they couldn't make out what was being said. One of the group members, feeling brave, stepped inside to investigate. The whispers suddenly grew louder and more intense, and the group member let out a blood-curdling scream. The rest of the group ran inside to find their friend being dragged across the floor by an unseen force. They tried to pull him back, but he was slipping further and further away from them. Suddenly, he was gone. The group was left in shock, but they knew they had to find their friend. They searched every room in the asylum, but he was nowhere to be found. As they made their way back to the entrance, they heard a faint sound coming from one of the rooms. They cautiously entered the room to find their friend sitting in the corner, rocking back and forth. He was mumbling something incoherent, and his eyes were glazed over. They tried to snap him out of it, but he didn't respond. As they made their way out of the asylum, they heard a faint whisper in their ears. It was the voice of their friend, but it sounded distorted and demonic. They knew that whatever had taken hold of him inside the asylum was not something they could explain. From that day on, the group was never the same. They all experienced strange occurrences that they couldn't explain. They would see shadowy figures lurking in their rooms at night and hear strange whispers in their ears. The asylum had left a mark on them that they would never be able to shake off. They knew that they had come face to face with something evil, something that was not meant to be disturbed. Years later, the asylum was demolished, but the memories still lingered on. Some say that the spirits of the patients who died there still haunt the site, seeking revenge on those who dare to trespass. Others say that the asylum was built on accursed ground, and that the evil that resides there can never be fully eradicated. Whatever the truth may be, one thing is for sure. The abandoned asylum still holds a mystery that has yet to be uncovered.
As a devoted gamer, David was always looking for new experiences to enhance his gaming sessions. So when he heard about a new virtual reality headset that promised to immerse him in his favorite games like never before, he was eager to try it out. David ordered the headset online and eagerly waited for it to arrive. When it finally did, he wasted no time setting it up and diving into his favorite game. At first, everything was amazing. The graphics were stunning, and the sound effects made him feel like he was really inside the game. But then, something strange began to happen. As David played, he started to notice small glitches in the game's graphics. At first, they were barely noticeable, but as he played on, they became more frequent and more severe. The sound effects, too, began to take on an eerie quality. David felt like he was being watched, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. One night, as he was playing a particularly intense game, David suddenly felt a chill run down his spine. He looked around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Then, he heard a faint whispering in his ear. He couldn't make out what it was saying, but he knew it was there. David quickly took off the headset and sat in silence for a moment. He was scared, but he didn't know why. It was just a game, after all. The next night, David decided to try the headset again. He told himself that it was just his imagination playing tricks on him and that there was nothing to be afraid of. But as soon as he put the headset on, he knew he had made a mistake. The glitches were back, and this time they were even more severe. The sound effects were distorted, and the once beautiful graphics had turned into a nightmarish landscape. David tried to take the headset off, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if it had become fused to his head. Panic set in as David realized he was trapped inside the game. He tried to call out for help, but his voice wouldn't work. He was completely alone. As the game went on, the glitches grew worse and worse. David felt like he was losing his mind. He was trapped inside a virtual nightmare, with no way out. Days turned into weeks, and David's family and friends became increasingly worried about his sudden disappearance. They searched for him everywhere, but he was nowhere to be found. Finally, after months of searching, David's family found his lifeless body in his bedroom. The VR headset was still fused to his head, and the game was still running on the screen. No one knows what really happened to David, but rumors began to spread that the game he was playing was haunted by the ghost of a former player who had died while playing it. Some say that if you listen closely, you can still hear David's ghostly whispers coming from the headset, warning others to stay away from the haunted VR headset. And so, the headset remains a cursed object that no one dares to touch. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the line between the virtual world and the real world is thinner than we think.
Sarah and her friends had always been interested in exploring abandoned places. So when they heard about an old hotel that had been shut down for years, they knew they had to check it out. They arrived at the hotel late at night, armed with flashlights and curiosity. As they walked through the deserted lobby, they couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. It was as if the hotel was watching them, waiting for them to make a wrong move. But they pressed on, eager to explore the dark, empty halls. As they climbed the stairs, Sarah felt a strange sensation in the pit of her stomach. She turned to her friends, but they seemed oblivious to the eerie atmosphere that surrounded them. The higher they climbed, the colder it got. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. It was as if the hotel was trying to warn them to leave, but they were too stubborn to listen. When they reached the top floor, they found a room that looked as though it had been untouched for decades. The wallpaper was peeling, and the furniture was covered in dust. But what caught their attention was the strange symbol that had been carved into the floor. It was a pentagram, surrounded by a circle of strange, arcane symbols. As they stood there, staring at the symbol, they heard a faint whispering. At first, it was too quiet to make out, but as they listened closer, they realized it was coming from the symbol itself. Suddenly, the room started to shake. The walls creaked and groaned, and the floor beneath their feet began to crack. Sarah and her friends ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped. As the shaking grew more intense, the whispering grew louder. It was as if the hotel was alive, and it was trying to communicate with them. Then, with a deafening roar, the floor gave way beneath them. They fell into a dark, bottomless pit, surrounded by the sound of demonic laughter. When they awoke, they found themselves in a dark, cavernous room. They were surrounded by shadows, and they could feel the presence of something dark and malevolent watching them. As they tried to find a way out, they realized that they were no longer in the hotel. They were in another realm entirely, a place where the laws of physics and reality no longer applied. Sarah and her friends were never seen again. Some say they're still trapped in the other realm, trying to find their way back to our world. Others say that they were consumed by the darkness that surrounded them, and that they're now part of the hotel's haunted past. Either way, the abandoned hotel remains a dark, foreboding presence on the outskirts of town. It serves as a warning to those who would dare to explore the unknown, a reminder that some places are better left untouched.
Tommy had always loved animals. From a young age, he would spend his free time at the local humane society, playing with the dogs and cats and helping to take care of them. Tommy arrived at the animal shelter just as the sun was setting one evening, his backpack slung over his shoulder. He had been volunteering there for the past few weeks, ever since his mom had suggested it as a way to get some community service hours for school. He loved spending time with the cats and dogs at the shelter. They were all so sweet and affectionate, despite their difficult circumstances. As he walked through the rows of cages, he paused to pet a fluffy gray cat who was lounging lazily.
"Hey there, little guy,"
he said, scratching the cat behind the ears. The cat purred contentedly, stretching out its long body. Tommy moved on to the dog cages, where he was greeted by a chorus of barks and whines. He opened the door to one of the cages, and a scruffy terrier bounded out, wagging its tail frantically.
Hey there, buddy!
Tommy said, kneeling down to pet the dog.
You're a good boy, aren't you?
The dog licked his face, and Tommy laughed. He loved the way the dogs and cats at the shelter seemed to know that he was there to help them. As the evening wore on, Tommy worked his way through the shelter, feeding the animals and cleaning their cages. By the time he was finished, it was getting dark outside, and he realized with a start that he was the only one left at the shelter. He shrugged, thinking that it wouldn't be too bad to spend the night there alone. He settled down in a chair in the office, pulling out a book to read. The shelter was in a quiet location, surrounded by dense forest, and Tommy felt a sense of calm as he settled in for the night. But as the night wore on, Tommy began to feel uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He tried to tell himself that it was just his imagination, but the feeling persisted. The shelter was quiet, too quiet. He couldn't hear any sounds coming from the forest outside, not even the usual rustling of leaves and branches. It was as if the whole world had gone silent. That's when he heard it. A low growl coming from one of the dog cages. Tommy walked over to investigate, but as he got closer, the growling grew louder and more menacing. He hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and reached for the latch. As soon as he opened the door, he was hit with a blast of cold air. It was freezing inside the cage, even though it had been warm just moments before. And then he saw it, a pair of glowing red eyes, staring back at him from the darkness. Tommy backed away, but it was too late. The creature lunged at him, its teeth bared and its claws extended. Tommy tried to run, but he tripped and fell, landing hard on the concrete floor. He looked up and saw the creature looming over him, its eyes glowing even brighter now in the darkness. He tried to scream, but no sound would come out. The creature was on him now, its claws digging into his flesh. Tommy felt a searing pain in his chest, and he knew he was going to die. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature vanished. Tommy lay on the floor, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around, but the shelter was empty now, except for the dogs and cats in their cages. Tommy stumbled to his feet and ran outside, into the cool night air. He collapsed on the grass, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was then that he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see a figure emerging from the woods, silhouetted against the moonlit sky. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man, but there was something strange about him. He was dressed in dark clothes, and his face was hidden in the shadows. The man walked towards Tommy, his steps slow and deliberate. Tommy tried to stand up, but he felt weak and dizzy. He stumbled backwards, trying to get away, but the man was too quick. He reached out and grabbed Tommy by the arm, pulling him close. And then Tommy saw his face. It was twisted and distorted, with jagged teeth and gray-wasted skin. Tommy's eyes widened in horror as he realized that the man was not human at all, but some kind of monstrous creature. The creature's grip on his arm was tight, and Tommy could feel its sharp claws digging into his flesh. He tried to pull away, but the creature's strength was too much for him. The creature leaned in close to Tommy, its breath hot and foul on his face.
You shouldn't be here.
It growled, its voice deep and menacing.
This place belongs to us.
Tommy tried to speak, but his throat was dry and his words came out as a hoarse whisper.
What are you?
He managed to ask. The creature grinned, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth.
We are the guardians of this place.
It said.
We protect it from those who would harm it. And you, little human, are not welcome here.
With that, the creature raised its other hand and slashed Tommy across the chest. Tommy cried out in pain as the claws tore through his flesh, leaving deep, bleeding wounds. The creature laughed, then pushed him to the ground and turned to leave. Tommy lay there, gasping for breath, watching as the creature disappeared into the woods. He knew he had to get help, but his strength was ebbing away, and he felt as if he was going to pass out at any moment. He closed his eyes, willing himself to stay conscious, to keep fighting. And then he heard the sound of barking, coming from the direction of the shelter. He forced himself to his feet and stumbled towards the noise, his vision swimming and his head pounding. When he arrived at the shelter, he saw that the dogs had somehow managed to escape their cages and were now barking furiously at the woods. Tommy stumbled over to them, collapsing to the ground as he reached them. And then he saw it. A flicker of movement, something darting through the trees. It was the creature coming back for him. Tommy knew he had to get out of there, to get to safety before it was too late. He struggled to his feet, using the dogs as support. He stumbled towards the road, the dogs barking and growling at his heels. And then, just as he reached the safety of the road, he saw the creature emerge from the woods, its eyes fixed on him. Tommy didn't stop running until he reached the safety of the town. He collapsed on the doorstep of the local police station, his wounds bleeding and his body battered. When the police arrived, they found him barely conscious, muttering about monsters and creatures in the woods. They didn't believe him, of course. They thought he was delirious or high on drugs. But Tommy knew the truth. He had seen the monsters that lurked in the woods, and he knew that they were still out there, waiting for their next victim.
Alice was a troubled young woman, haunted by the demons of her past. She had a difficult childhood, filled with neglect and abuse, which left deep scars on her psyche. As she grew older, her mind became more and more unstable, and she retreated into a world of her own making, a world of magic and wonder, inspired by the stories she had read as a child. One day, while wandering through the woods, Alice stumbled upon a rabbit hole. Without thinking, she climbed down into it, and found herself in a strange and eerie place, where nothing was as it seemed. The world was filled with bizarre creatures, talking animals, and impossible landscapes, and Alice was both fascinated and terrified by it all. As she explored this strange land, Alice encountered a series of surreal and disturbing characters. There was the Cheshire Cat, a grinning feline with razor-sharp teeth, who taunted and teased her with his cryptic remarks.
"Why, hello there, little Alice,"
said the Cheshire Cat, his eyes gleaming in the darkness.
"What brings you to this neck of the woods?"
I don't know,
stammered Alice, feeling a cold sweat break out on her brow.
"Oh, that's right,"
said the cat, licking his lips hungrily.
"You're lost, aren't you? Well, don't worry. I'm sure you'll find your way, eventually."
There was the Queen of Hearts, a tyrannical ruler who ordered the executions of her subjects at the slightest provocation.
"Off with her head!"
screamed the Queen of Hearts, pointing a blood-stained finger at Alice.
"How dare she disobey my orders?"
but Your Majesty,
pleaded Alice, her voice trembling with fear.
I didn't mean to offend you. I was just...
"Silence!"
roared the Queen, her face contorted with rage.
"I won't have insolence in my court! Guards, take her away!"
And there was the Mad Hatter, a deranged lunatic who invited Alice to a gruesome tea party, where the guests were all decapitated heads.
"Welcome. Welcome. Dear Alice,"
said the Mad Hatter, grinning madly as he poured her a cup of tea.
"do make yourself comfortable. We're just getting started."
What? What is this?
asked Alice, her eyes widening in horror as she saw the severed heads on the table.
Why, it's tea party, my dear,
said the Mad Hatter, his voice laced with insanity.
Aren't you thrilled?
Alice tried to make sense of it all, but the more she tried, the more confused she became. The world of Wonderland was like a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from, and every new encounter only added to her sense of dread and disorientation. But as Alice delved deeper into this twisted realm, she began to realize something disturbing. The creatures she met, the places she visited, and the events she witnessed were not real. They were all figments of her own imagination, manifestations of her own delusions and psychosis. In reality, Alice was not in Wonderland at all. She was still in the woods, lost and alone, and her mind had conjured up this fantasy world as a way of coping with her own trauma and pain. But instead of finding solace and escape, Alice's delusions had driven her to madness, and now she was trapped in a terrifying world of her own making. As Alice came to this realization, her grip on reality began to slip even further. She started to hear voices in her head, urging her to do terrible things. She saw visions of blood and violence, and felt an uncontrollable urge to act on them. And so, in a fit of insanity, Alice began to commit acts of unspeakable horror. She attacked the creatures of Wonderland, mutilating and dismembering them with a ferocity that terrified even herself. She set fire to the Queen's palace, watching gleefully as the flames consumed everything in their path. And in her most horrifying act, she killed the Mad Hatter, cutting off his head and using it as a trophy. In the end, Alice was found by a group of travelers who were passing through the woods. They were horrified by what they saw, and called for the authorities to take her away. Alice was taken to a mental institution, where she spent the rest of her life, haunted by the memories of her time in Wonderland, and tormented by the voices in her head. But even in death, Alice's legacy lived on. The story of her descent into madness and violence became a cautionary tale, warning others of the dangers of losing oneself in delusion and fantasy. And the world of Wonderland, once seen as a place of magic and wonder, became a symbol of the horrors that lurked in the human mind.
Once there was a teen girl named Diana who had always been prone to nightmares. As a child, she had terrifying dreams of being chased by shadowy monsters and falling into endless pits. But as she got older, her nightmares began to change. They became more vivid, more lifelike. And soon, they started bleeding into her reality. At first, it was just little things. Diana would see glimpses of her dreams in the world around her. A tree would look like a monster's claw, a cloud like a skull. She could shake them off, convince herself that they were just tricks of the light. But then, things got worse. One night, Diana dreamt that she was trapped in a dark room with no way out. She could hear the sound of someone breathing, but she couldn't see who it was. Suddenly, a pair of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, and Diana knew she was not alone. She woke up screaming, covered in sweat. The next day, Diana found a strange note in her locker. It was written in a spiky, unfamiliar handwriting, and it read,
"I see you, Diana. I know your fears."
Diana was unnerved, but she tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just a prank. But as the days went on, more strange things started happening. Diana would catch glimpses of shadowy figures out of the corner of her eye, hear whispers in her ear when no one was there. And every night, her dreams grew more and more vivid. One night, Diana dreamt that she was in a graveyard. She could feel the cold wind on her face and hear the sound of creaking trees. She saw a figure in the distance, and as she got closer, she realized it was a boy she knew from school. But he was different in her dream. His eyes were black, his skin was pale, and he was holding a knife. Diana woke up in a cold sweat, gasping for air. And then, she saw him. The boy from her dream was standing at the foot of her bed, his eyes glowing in the darkness. Diana screamed, and her parents came running. But when they turned on the light, there was no one there. They told her it was just a nightmare, that she was imagining things. But Diana knew what she had seen. The next day, the boy from her dream didn't show up at school. No one seemed to know where he was. Diana was worried, but she tried to convince herself that it was just a coincidence. But then, another note appeared in her locker.
You can't run from me, Diana. I'm coming for you.
Diana was terrified. She didn't know who was sending the notes, or what they wanted from her. She tried to talk to her friends, but they didn't believe her. They thought she was just being paranoid. And then, the nightmares took a dark turn. Diana dreamt that she was being chased through a dark forest by an unseen force. She could hear the sound of snapping twigs and heavy breathing behind her. She stumbled and fell, and when she looked up, she saw the boy from her dream standing over her. But he wasn't alone. There were other figures with him, shadowy and indistinct. They closed in on her, and Diana knew that this time, it wasn't just a dream. She could feel their cold breath on her skin. Diana woke up screaming, but this time, she wasn't alone. Her parents rushed into her room, but they were too late. Diana was gone. The police searched for her for weeks, but there was no trace. Her friends mourned her, but they never found out what happened to her. Years went by, and Diana's disappearance became a cold case. Her family moved on, but they never forgot her. Her mother, who had suffered a lot after her daughter's disappearance, developed dementia and had to be placed in a nursing home. One night, Diana's mother had a nightmare about her daughter. She saw Diana standing in front of her, but something was off. Her daughter looked different, like a nightmare version of herself. Her eyes were black and her skin was pale. The nightmare version of Diana slowly approached her and whispered something in her ear before disappearing. When her mother woke up, she realized that something was different. Her room looked slightly off, and she could hear a faint sound of footsteps coming from outside her door. As she got out of bed and looked around, she saw Diana standing in front of her. But it wasn't the Diana that she had remembered. It was the nightmare version of Diana that had entered reality. Diana's mother screamed for help, but the nurses didn't believe her. They thought she was just imagining things, a symptom of her dementia. But Diana was real. She was back, and she was seeking revenge on the people who had hurt her. Diana's nightmare version was stronger, faster, and more vicious than anyone could have imagined. She had supernatural powers and was able to control people's minds. Her mother was the first to fall under her spell, and she became her pawn. Diana began her rampage, taking out everyone who had doubted her when she went missing. Her friends, her family, even the police officers who had failed to find her. No one was safe from her wrath. But as Diana's power grew, so did her anger. She began to lash out at anyone who crossed her path, regardless of whether they were involved in her disappearance or not. She became a monster, a force of pure vengeance. In the end, there was no stopping her. Diana's nightmare version was too strong, too powerful. She continued to wreak havoc, destroying anyone who stood in her way. And then, one day, she simply disappeared. No one knew where Diana went or what became of her. Some believed that she was still out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for her next victim. Others believed that she had simply faded away, a nightmare that had finally come to an end. But Diana's mother knew the truth. She knew that her daughter was still out there, watching over her, protecting her from the people who had hurt her. And even though she couldn't remember who Diana really was, she knew that she was loved, and that she would always be a part of her life.
Dorothy had never seen anything like the twisted yellow brick road before. It wound through a dark, foreboding forest, its path illuminated only by the occasional flash of lightning. She clutched Toto close to her chest and shuddered, wondering what kind of place she had stumbled upon. As she walked, the trees around her seemed to come alive, their branches reaching out to her like gnarled fingers. A chill ran down her spine, and she quickened her pace. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning struck a nearby tree, illuminating the path ahead. Dorothy gasped in horror as she saw a group of strange creatures emerge from the shadows. They were small and misshapen, with twisted limbs and jagged teeth. They scurried towards her, their beady eyes gleaming in the darkness. Dorothy stumbled backwards, tripping over a gnarled root. Toto barked in alarm as the creatures closed in on them, their claws scratching at her dress. Just as all hope seemed lost, a figure appeared out of the darkness. It was a woman, dressed in flowing robes and wielding a staff. The creatures recoiled in fear as she approached, her eyes blazing with an otherworldly light.
Stay back!
She commanded, her voice ringing out like a bell.
These children are under my protection.
The creatures hissed and spat, but eventually retreated back into the shadows. Dorothy stared in awe at the woman, unsure whether to thank her or run away.
Who are you?
She asked tentatively. The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in her eyes.
I am the Witch of the West,
she said.
And you, my dear, are in grave danger.
Dorothy felt a chill run down her spine at the witch's words. She knew she was far from home, and everything she had seen so far had only confirmed her worst fears. The twisted yellow brick road, the strange creatures, and now this mysterious woman warning her of danger.
What do you mean, danger?
Dorothy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Witch of the West's expression grew even more severe.
You are not in Kansas anymore, my child,
she said.
This land is ruled by a cruel and wicked sorcerer known as the Wizard of Oz. He will stop at nothing to maintain his power, and anyone who opposes him risks their very lives.
Dorothy felt a lump form in her throat.
But I didn't come here to oppose anyone,
she said.
I just want to go home.
The Witch of the West regarded her for a moment, as if sizing her up.
Very well,
she said finally.
I will help you. But first, we must make a detour.
Dorothy had no choice but to follow the witch deeper into the forest, her heart pounding with every step. The trees grew denser and the air grew colder, until they finally arrived at a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone altar, surrounded by candles and strange symbols. The witch began to chant, her voice rising in a crescendo that sent shivers down Dorothy's spine. As the last syllable echoed through the air, a dark figure appeared before them. He was tall and menacing, with eyes that glowed like embers.
Who dares to summon me?
He growled. The witch stepped forward, undaunted.
I am the Witch of the West,
she said.
And I have come to bargain.
The figure regarded her with interest.
What do you want?
The witch's voice was low and steady.
I seek the aid of the Wicked One,
she said.
The Wizard of Oz has taken a young girl from her home, and I need your help to retrieve her.
The figure chuckled, a sound that made the hairs on the back of Dorothy's neck stand up.
You expect me to help you? And why should I trust you?
The witch produced a small vial from within her robes.
Because I have something you want,
she said.
This is the potion of eternal life. With it, you will never age or die. But you must agree to help me first.
The figure regarded the vial with interest.
Very well,
Said finally.
I will help you. But be warned, the Wizard of Oz is not easily defeated.
Dorothy's heart was racing as they left the clearing and continued down the twisted yellow brick road. She had no idea what kind of danger lay ahead, but she knew she was in good hands with the Witch of the West. As they walked, the witch filled Dorothy in on the history of the land of Oz. She told her about the 4 witches who had once ruled the land in peace until the arrival of the wizard. The wizard had seized power and banished the witches to the far corners of Oz, where they could no longer challenge his rule.
And now, he has taken another victim,
the witch said, her eyes narrowing.
a young girl like yourself, who dared to oppose him. But we will not let him win. We will fight to the death if we must.
Dorothy felt a surge of courage at the witch's words. She had never been one to back down from a challenge, and now she felt like she was part of something much bigger than herself. As they walked, they encountered more strange creatures, giant spiders with glowing red eyes, winged monkeys with razor-sharp talons, and even a pack of wolves with fur as black as coal. But each time, the Witch of the West stepped forward, her staff glowing with an otherworldly light. She drove the creatures back with ease, never once breaking a sweat. At last, they came to a great stone fortress, guarded by fierce soldiers with gleaming swords. Dorothy's heart sank as she saw the imposing structure, but the witch simply strode forward, her head held high.
I demand an audience with the Wizard of Oz,
she declared, her voice echoing off the stone walls. The guard sneered at her.
You have no business here.
One of them spat.
Leave now, or suffer the consequences.
But the witch was not deterred. She raised her staff, and a bolt of lightning shot out, striking the guard in the chest. He crumpled to the ground, smoke rising from his charred body. The other guards looked on in horror, and for a moment, Dorothy thought they might attack. But then, to her surprise, they parted, allowing the witch and Dorothy to pass. They entered the fortress, the door slamming shut behind them. Dorothy felt like she had just stepped into a nightmare, and she had no idea what horrors lay ahead. The Witch of the West led Dorothy through a maze of corridors, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. Dorothy felt like they were walking deeper and deeper into a maze, and she had no idea how they would ever find their way out. At last, they arrived at a pair of ornate double doors. The witch pushed them open, revealing a chamber so opulent that Dorothy's jaw dropped. The walls were lined with gold, and glittering jewels sparkled from every surface. In the center of the room stood a throne, upon which sat the Wizard of Oz himself. He was a small man, with a round face and a bald head. But despite his unassuming appearance, Dorothy could sense a cold, calculating energy emanating from him.
Who dares to disturb me?
He boomed, his voice filling the room. The Witch of the West stepped forward, her staff held at the ready.
I am the Witch of the West,
she said.
And I have come to claim what is mine.
The wizard laughed, a sound that made Dorothy's skin crawl.
And what is it that you seek?
The witch's voice was low and dangerous.
I seek the young girl you have taken from her home,
she said.
And I will stop at nothing to get her back.
The wizard's expression grew cold.
You are a fool if you think you can challenge me,
he said.
I have power beyond your wildest dreams.
But the witch was undaunted. She raised her staff, and a bolt of lightning shot out, striking the wizard in the chest. He howled in pain, but before he could retaliate, the witch began to chant. Dorothy watched in awe as the room filled with an otherworldly energy. The walls shook, and the jewels glittered even brighter. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The wizard lay sprawled on the ground, his body writhing in pain. The witch approached him, a look of triumph on her face.
You will release the girl,
she said.
And you will never lay a hand on her again.
The wizard nodded weakly, and with a wave of the witch's staff, Dorothy felt herself being lifted into the air. She soared through the chamber, past the glittering jewels, and out of the fortress. When she landed back on the yellow brick road, she was surrounded by the witch's followers. They cheered and clapped, and Dorothy felt like she had never been more alive. But even as she celebrated, she knew that she was still a long way from home. She had survived the horrors of Anne's, but the journey ahead would be even more treacherous. Dorothy walked down the yellow brick road, her mind spinning with thoughts of the horrors she had witnessed in the witch's fortress. She had never seen such powerful magic before, and she wondered if there was anything in Anne's that could stop the witch. As she walked, she began to notice that the landscape around her had changed. The grass was no longer green, but a sickly yellow color. The trees were black and twisted, and the air was thick with fog. Dorothy felt a chill run down her spine. This place was like nothing she had ever seen before, and she had a feeling that it was not a safe place to be. Suddenly, she heard a rustling in the bushes. She stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to calm herself, telling herself that it was probably just a small animal. But as the rustling grew louder, she realized that it was something much bigger. A figure stepped out of the bushes, and Dorothy gasped in horror. It was a tall, gaunt man with long, bony fingers and a face like a skull. He wore a tattered black cloak, and his eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. The man beckoned to Dorothy with a skeletal hand, and she felt a strange compulsion to follow him. She tried to resist, but her feet began to move of their own accord. She followed the man through the twisted forest, her mind filled with a sense of dread. She knew that something was terribly wrong, but she couldn't seem to shake the feeling that she was being led towards something even more sinister. At last, they came to a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a large tree, its trunk as thick as a house. The man pointed to the tree, and Dorothy realized with horror that it was covered in faces. The faces were twisted in agony, their eyes staring out blankly. Dorothy felt a surge of terror as she realized that these were the faces of people who had been lost in the forest. The man turned to Dorothy, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light.
You have trespassed in the haunted forest,
he said.
And now you must pay the price.
Dorothy tried to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot. She watched in horror as the man raised his arms, and the faces on the tree began to twist and contort. She screamed as the faces began to melt and fuse together, forming a grotesque monster. It had too many limbs and too many eyes, and it lumbered towards her with a hunger that made her blood run cold. Dorothy tried to fight back, but the monster was too strong. She felt its slimy tentacles wrap around her, and she knew that she was doomed. But just as she was about to give up hope, a bright light shone out from her pocket. It was the ruby slippers, and they were glowing with an otherworldly energy. Dorothy reached into her pocket, and as she touched the slippers, she felt a surge of power flow through her. She raised her hand, and a bolt of lightning shot out, striking the monster. The creature screamed and writhed, but Dorothy stood her ground. She channeled all of her fear and anger into a blast of pure energy, and with a final roar, the monster disintegrated into dust. Dorothy stood there, panting and trembling. She had never felt so alive, and yet so terrified. She knew that she had survived the haunted forest, but she had a feeling that her journey was far from over. Dorothy continued on her journey, her heart racing with adrenaline. She had never felt so alive, and yet so scared. The haunted forest had been a nightmare, and she was relieved to leave it behind. As she walked, she began to notice that the landscape was changing once again. The trees were no longer black and twisted, but tall and green. The grass was no longer yellow, but a bright shade of emerald. In the distance, she could see a city, its spires reaching up towards the sky. She knew that it was the Emerald City, and she felt a surge of hope. She quickened her pace, eager to reach the city and find the wizard. She knew that he was her only hope of defeating the witch, and she prayed that he would be able to help her. As she approached the city, she could see that it was even more beautiful than she had imagined. The buildings were made of glittering green emeralds, and the streets were paved with sparkling jewels. But as she drew closer, she realized that something was wrong. The streets were deserted, and the buildings were dark and empty. There was no sign of life anywhere. Dorothy felt a sense of unease wash over her. This was not what she had expected. She had thought that the city would be a refuge, a place of safety in the midst of the chaos of ants. But as she walked through the empty streets, she realized that something terrible had happened. The city was abandoned, and she was all alone. She wandered through the city, searching for any sign of life. She called out, but her voice echoed back to her unanswered. She began to feel a sense of despair wash over her. Was this the end of her journey? Had she come all this way for nothing? Suddenly, she heard a sound. It was a faint whisper, a voice coming from somewhere deep within the city. She followed the sound, her heart pounding with hope. She came to a large building, its doors covered in gold and precious stones. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was dark, but she could see a faint glow coming from the far end of the room. She walked towards the glow, her heart beating faster with each step. As she drew closer, she could see that the glow was coming from a throne. And sitting on the throne was a figure, his face hidden in shadow.
Dorothy,
said the figure.
I have been expecting you.
Dorothy felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew that this was the wizard, but she couldn't see his face.
What happened to the city?
She asked. The wizard sighed.
The witch has taken everything from me,
he said.
My power, my followers, my city. I am nothing now but a shadow of my former self.
Dorothy felt a surge of anger rise up within her. She knew that the witch had to be stopped, no matter what the cost.
I need your help,
she said.
I need to defeat the witch, and I can't do it alone.
The wizard leaned forward.
I can help you,
he said.
But you must bring me the witch's broomstick. It is the source of her power, and without it she is vulnerable.
Dorothy nodded, her mind racing with plans. She knew that this would not be easy, but she was determined to do whatever it took to defeat the witch. She turned and walked out of the throne room, her mind focused on her mission. She had come too far to fail now, and she would soldier on. Dorothy left the Emerald City and headed towards the witch's castle, determined to find the broomstick and bring it back to the wizard. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her stomach. The castle was just ahead, looming in the distance like a dark shadow. She approached the castle gates, her heart racing with fear. She pushed them open and stepped inside. The castle was dark and silent, but she could feel eyes watching her from the shadows. She walked cautiously through the halls, her hand on the hilt of her sword. She came to a large room and gasped in horror at what she saw. The witch was there, her back turned to Dorothy. She was standing over a cauldron, stirring something dark and sinister. Dorothy raised her sword, ready to strike. But before she could move, the witch turned around, a wicked smile on her face.
Well,
Said the witch.
look who's come to pay me a visit. Dorothy, my dear, I've been expecting you.
Dorothy gritted her teeth, ready for a fight.
I've come for your broomstick.
She said. The witch laughed.
You think you can defeat me?
She said.
I am more powerful than you can possibly imagine. And soon, all of Oz will bow down to me.
Dorothy lunged forward, her sword flashing in the dim light. The witch dodged her attack and sent a bolt of dark energy hurtling towards Dorothy. Dorothy jumped out of the way, narrowly avoiding the blast. She swung her sword again, but the witch was too quick for her. They continued to fight, each one trying to gain the upper hand. Dorothy was fast and agile, but the witch was powerful and experienced. Finally, after what felt like hours of fighting, Dorothy saw her chance. The witch was distracted for a moment, and Dorothy struck. She plunged her sword into the witch's chest and watched as she crumpled to the ground. Dorothy gasped for breath, her heart racing with adrenaline. She had done it. She had defeated the witch. She walked over to the cauldron and saw that it was filled with a dark, bubbling liquid. She knew that this was the source of the witch's power, and she destroyed it with a flick of her wrist. She searched the room and found the broomstick hidden in a corner. She picked it up and felt a surge of power coursing through her body. She knew that she had to hurry back to the wizard before it was too late. She left the castle and ran as fast as she could towards the Emerald City. As she ran, she felt the ground shaking beneath her feet. She knew that she was running out of time. She had to reach the wizard before it was too late. She burst into the throne room and held out the broomstick. The wizard took the broomstick and held it up to the light.
Yes!
He said.
This is it! With this, we can defeat the witch once and for all!
Dorothy felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had done it. She had saved Anne's. But as she looked at the wizard, she realized that there was something strange about him. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she knew that something was wrong. And then she saw it. The glint of the witch's magic in his eerie eyes. Dorothy saw the glint of the witch's magic in the wizard's eyes. She gasped, realizing the truth.
You've been the witch all along!
The wizard laughed, a cruel, mocking sound.
Very good, Dorothy,
he said.
You figured it out. But it's too late now. With the power of the broomstick, I am unstoppable.
Dorothy felt a surge of anger and betrayal.
How could you do this?
She demanded.
How could you betray us like this?
The witch wizard shrugged.
It's simple, really. Power. That's all that matters in this world. And with the broomstick, I have more power than I ever dreamed possible.
Dorothy raised her sword, ready to fight.
I won't let you get away with this,
she said. The witch wizard laughed.
You can try, my dear. But you'll never defeat me.
They charged towards each other, swords clashing. The witch wizard was powerful, but Dorothy was determined. She fought with all her might, dodging and striking, trying to find a weakness in her opponent's defense. Finally, after what felt like hours, Dorothy saw her chance. The witch wizard was distracted for a moment, and Dorothy struck. She plunged her sword into the witch wizard's chest and watched as he crumpled to the ground. Dorothy collapsed, exhausted but victorious. She had saved Anse from the clutches of the witch wizard, and she had proven herself to be a true hero. As she lay there, catching her breath, she heard a voice behind her.
Dorothy?
She turned around and saw her friend standing there, looking at her with concern.
Toto!
She cried, hugging her faithful companion.
You're all right.
The Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Lion all rushed to her side, helping her to her feet.
You did it, Dorothy! You saved Oz!
Said the Scarecrow. Dorothy smiled, feeling a sense of pride and accomplishment.
Yes,
she said.
We did it. Together.
And with that, they all walked towards the horizon, ready for their next adventure.
The year was 1800, and the colonies of North America were still under the control of the British Empire. The rebellion that had sparked in 1775 had failed, crushed under the might of the British military. The leaders of the rebellion had been captured and executed, and the surviving colonists had been forced to swear allegiance to the crown or face dire consequences. But even though the rebellion had failed, there were still pockets of resistance scattered throughout the colonies. Secret societies and underground movements worked tirelessly to undermine British rule, and they were willing to do whatever it took to achieve their goals. It was in one such society that Jonathan found himself. He had been born in the colony of Virginia, just a few years before the failed revolution. His parents had been killed by British soldiers when he was just a boy, and he had been taken in by the society as an orphan. Jonathan was now a young man, and he had grown up with a burning hatred for the British. He had seen firsthand the cruelty and oppression of their rule, and he was determined to do everything in his power to fight against it. One night, the society called a secret meeting in a remote location deep in the woods. Jonathan made his way to the meeting place, his heart pounding with anticipation. He had heard rumors that the society had uncovered a powerful weapon that could turn the tide of the war and bring down the British once and for all. As he approached the meeting place, he could see that something was different. The air was thick with an eerie silence, and the woods were shrouded in an unnatural darkness. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed through the fear and made his way towards the clearing. What he saw there made his blood run cold. The members of the society were all gathered around a large stone altar, and in the center of the altar was a glowing crystal. The crystal pulsed with a sickly green light, and Jonathan could feel its power radiating through the air. One of the society's leaders stepped forward and addressed the group.
"My friends,"
he said, his voice echoing through the woods,
"we have discovered the source of the British power. This crystal is the key to their strength. If we destroy it, we can bring down their entire empire."
Jonathan felt a surge of hope. This was it, he thought. This was the weapon they needed to win the war. But then, the leader continued.
"But be warned. This crystal is protected by dark magic. It is guarded by a powerful demon, and any who try to destroy it will face a terrible fate."
Jonathan hesitated for a moment, but then he stepped forward. He knew the risks, but he was willing to do whatever it took to achieve their goals. As he reached out to grab the crystal, he felt a sudden rush of cold air. The ground beneath him shook, and a deep, guttural voice filled his mind.
"Foolish mortal!
The voice boomed.
You think you can destroy me? You think you can take away the powers that I have granted to the British Empire? You are nothing but insects to me, and I will crush you like the vermin that you are."
Jonathan tried to back away, but he was rooted to the spot. The crystal pulsed with an even brighter light, and he felt a searing pain in his mind. He screamed, his body convulsing as he felt his sanity slipping away. The other members of the society were too terrified to move, too afraid to face the demon that had been unleashed. Jonathan's mind was being consumed by the demon's power. He felt himself falling deeper into a dark abyss, unable to control his own thoughts. The demon had taken over his mind, and he was now its puppet. As he looked around, he saw that the other members of the society had all been reduced to mindless husks. They were now under the demon's control, and their sole purpose was to do its bidding. The demon had a plan. It would use the crystal to amplify its power, and then it would unleash its wrath on the entire British Empire. The colonies would be destroyed, and the demon would rule over the ashes. Jonathan could feel the demon's plan taking shape in his mind. He tried to fight it, to resist its control, but it was too powerful. He was trapped, a prisoner in his own body. The demon's power grew stronger with each passing moment. Jonathan could feel the crystal pulsing with an almost palpable energy, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before the demon would unleash its fury on the world. And then, suddenly, the crystal shattered. It exploded into a million pieces, and the demon's power was dispersed. Jonathan felt his mind returning to him, and he realized that he was no longer under the demon's control. He looked around and saw that the other members of the society were all lying on the ground, unconscious. They had been freed from the demon's control, but Jonathan knew that they would never be the same. The demon was gone, but its presence still lingered in the air. Jonathan could feel a sense of unease growing within him, and he knew that something was not right. And then, he saw it. A dark figure was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching them. It was the demon, and it was smiling.
You may have destroyed the crystal,
the demon said,
but you cannot destroy me. I will always be here, lurking in the shadows, waiting for my chance to return. And when I do, I will be even stronger than before.
With that, the demon disappeared, leaving Jonathan and the other members of the society to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The failed revolution had unleashed a horror that would haunt the colonies for generations to come. The demon's presence was felt in every corner of the New World, a constant reminder of the cost of rebellion and the price of freedom.
Edgar Allan Poe sat in his study, trying to come up with a new story to write. Outside it was dark with a blustering snowstorm rolling in. Typically, this was ideal writing conditions for the dark and mysterious writer. However, he had been feeling uninspired lately, and his writing had suffered as a result. He was lost in thought when he heard a loud banging at the door. He got up from his desk and opened the door to find a disheveled man standing there. It was his neighbor, Mr. Willoughby.
Please, sir,
Willoughby said,
you have to help me. My wife is very sick, and I don't know what to do.
Poe's inner alarm bell began to chime, sounding like a fast heartbeat coming from somewhere deep inside the darkness of him. There had been whispers around the town of late. Whispers of something dark. Something twisted. Whispers of revenants. Poe was hesitant to help the man, but something in his eyes made him feel sympathetic.
What's wrong with her?
Poe asked.
She's been acting strange. She doesn't seem like herself. And she keeps saying she's hungry, but she won't eat anything.
Again Poe was fearful. Willoughby's claims were precisely the same as the quietly creeping rumors about the region. Individuals who become very ill. So ill that they perish. But then, seemingly under the power of the very devil himself, they return against all odds, only to pass on their dastardly affliction to others. Poe had yet to witness the phenomenon himself, so he'd merely brushed it all off as idle gossip. However, seeing Willoughby's distress on this dark and stormy night certainly gave him pause.
I'll come with you,
Poe said.
but we have to be careful.
The neighbor led Poe to his home, which was but a few doors down the way from Poe's. As they approached the house, Poe could hear strange noises coming from inside. Willoughby opened the door, and Poe could see poor Mrs. Willoughby lying on the couch. She looked pale and weak, flickering shadows from the candles crossing her gaunt face, and her eyes were glazed over. Poe approached her cautiously.
What's your name?
He asked. He fully well knew her name to be Hilary Willoughby. But did she know? The woman didn't answer. Instead, she lunged at Poe, trying to bite him. He reared back, managing to dodge her, but he realized that she was beyond saving. She was already one of the, dare he say it? Undead. A revenant. He looked at Willoughby, searching for any indication that the dear fellow understood what had begotten his poorly wife. Poe turned to the man.
I'm sorry, but there's nothing we can do for her.
The man broke down in tears.
What am I going to do?
He asked. Poe thought for a moment.
There's only one thing we can do. We have to get out of here before she comes after us.
There were other things that could be done, according to the rumors. But Poe was surely not willing to be the one to end this revenant's misery. He knew he could never bring himself to do such a ghastly thing. They quickly gathered their wits about them and left the house, stealing into the night. The air swirled with thick, heavy snow by then. As they were walking down the street, they saw more and more revenants. It was clear that the infection had spread beyond just one person. The nightmare was no longer a rumor born of the overactive imaginations of bored ladies at the house. It was real. Poe knew that they had to find a safe place to hide. He remembered a story he had heard about a crypt in the cemetery that was said to be impregnable. He led Willoughby there, and they managed to get inside just before the revenants caught up to them. The crypt was dark and musty, but it was safe. Poe and the man sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the revenants outside. Poe knew that they couldn't stay there forever, but he didn't know what their next move should be. He produced a match from his coat pocket and lit a lone lamp on the crypt wall. As they sat in the crypt, Poe began to feel inspired. He realized that this was the perfect setting for a story. He pulled out a piece of paper and began to write. Willoughby glared at Poe, aghast.
Do you believe this to be the appropriate time for your scribbles, Poe?
He demanded. Poe gave him a sheepish look.
Apologies, Willoughby, but it's important to strike whilst the iron is hot.
He wrote about Willoughby and his wife, and how they had been caught in the middle of a revenant outbreak. He wrote about their struggles to survive, and the sacrifices they had to make in order to stay alive. He wrote about the fear and the desperation that they felt, and the hope that they clung to. As he wrote, Poe felt his creativity returning. He felt like he was back in his element, and he knew that he had a masterpiece on his hands. When he finished writing, he looked up to find that Willoughby had long since fallen asleep and morning had risen outside the crypt. Poe smiled, knowing that he had given the man a brief respite from the horrors of the world outside, and now the groans of the swarming revenants had gone. Poe didn't know how long they stayed in the crypt, but eventually, they knew they had to leave. They ventured outside cautiously, Poe clutching his work of genius to his chest, and to their surprise, they found that the revenants had disappeared. They walked around the city, trying to make sense of what had happened. It was as if the revenants had never existed in the first place. Poe couldn't explain it, but he knew that it was a miracle. As they walked, they came across a group of survivors. They had managed to band together and fight off the revenants, who mostly prowled at night. Poe and Willoughby joined the group, and together they worked to rebuild their community. As time passed and the community continued to thrive, Poe became obsessed with understanding the origins of the revenant outbreak. He knew that there had to be an explanation for what had happened, and he was determined to find it. He spent countless hours poring over old books and manuscripts, trying to find any clue that could help him solve the mystery. And finally, he found it. It turned out that the Revenant outbreak had been caused by a rare virus that was discovered by a group of scientists who were conducting research in the nearby mountains. They had been studying the virus, hoping to find a cure for a deadly disease that was plaguing the region. But something had gone terribly wrong. One of the scientists had accidentally contaminated the virus with a strain of rabies, and the virus had mutated into something far more dangerous. The virus had spread quickly, infecting everyone who came into contact with it. And as people succumbed to the virus, they became the undead, driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. Poe was horrified by what he had learned, but he was also relieved. He knew that the Revenant outbreak had not been caused by some supernatural force, but by a scientific experiment gone wrong. He wrote about the virus in great detail, hoping that his words would serve as a warning to future generations. And as he looked out over the community that he had helped to build, he knew that his words had the power to change the world. Poe continued to write, and his story about the Revenant outbreak and his old pal, Willoughby, became a bestseller. It was hailed as a masterpiece, and it helped to cement his place in literary history. Years later, when Poe was an old man, he would tell the story of the Revenant outbreak to his grandchildren. They would listen in awe as he described the horrors that he had seen, and they would marvel at his bravery. In the end, Poe knew that the Revenant outbreak had changed him. It had given him a new appreciation for life, and it had reminded him that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope. But as Poe grew older, his health began to decline. He was plagued by a mysterious illness that doctors could not cure. Eventually, Poe succumbed to the illness and passed away. His old friend Willoughby and his own wife had long since died, and only the townsfolk and the world of book lovers were left to mourn him. The community was devastated by the loss of their beloved writer, but their grief was short-lived. Within a few days, something strange began to happen. The ground above Poe's grave began to shift and groan, and soon a revenant emerged from the earth. The community was horrified by the sight of Poe, now a revenant, stumbling through the streets. But they soon realized that something miraculous had happened. Poe, even as a revenant, retained his intelligence and his ability to write. Perhaps it was his years of deep study and understanding of the virus, along with his passion for ink and quill, that left him with the ability to crave creativity along with the longing to feast upon human flesh. The community rallied together and built a little crypt with windows to keep Poe in, where people could come visit and talk to him. He, of course, could not carry on a real conversation with them. He usually only gnashed his teeth and raged against the window panes, or he sat at his wooden writing desk, scrawling away at one macabre story after another, altogether unaware of his fans surrounding the crypt. At first, it was a shock to see their hero as a revenant, but over time, people grew to accept it. Poe spent his days writing, and people would come from far and wide to see him. They would sit in front of the windows of the crypt, lovingly watching as Poe scribbled away at his papers. In the end, Poe's revenant state became something of a novelty. People would bring their friends and family to see him, and they would take pictures and laugh at the absurdity of it all. To this very day, he remains, in a little-known cemetery in a little-known burg right outside of Boston, Mass. And so, Edgar Allan Poe, the master of horror, became a revenant, and even in death, he continued to inspire and entertain.